The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR. This is where I did my research paper on. There's a map showing where the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is in Alaska, and there's just a picture of some of the landscape. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, located in northeastern Alaska, is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Spanning over 19 million acres, this remote and pristine refuge is a critical habitat for a wide range of wildlife, including polar bears, caribou, musk oxen, and hundreds of migratory bird species. It is home to unique ecosystems, including fragile permafrost layers that are vulnerable to climate change. The management of permafrost in this region is essential due to its impact on the environment, wildlife, and infrastructure, including oil exploration activities. ANWR also contains unique geological features and potential oil and gas reserves, making it a focal point of conservation and development debates. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service oversees its management, emphasizing habitat preservation, wildlife monitoring, and balancing ecological integrity with limited human impact. Here is just a picture of the area of interest to oil companies. As you can see, it is in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. There's a lot of debate around this issue, and I do mention it a couple times. So this is why I wanted to include this picture. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge Comprehensive Conservation Plan addresses permafrost primarily in the context of climate, habitat, and environmental protection. Key points include that permafrost as a critical feature. The plan recognizes that permafrost underlies much of ANWR and plays a crucial role in maintaining the tundra ecosystem, influencing vegetation, hydrology, and wildlife habitat. The management plan acknowledges the risks posed by climate change, particularly permafrost degradation, which can lead to shifts in ecosystems, altered water flow, and potential habitat loss for species dependent on stable tundra conditions. In areas considered for oil and gas exploration, the plan considers permafrost stability in assessing potential environmental impacts. Infrastructure development can accelerate permafrost thaw, lead to ground subsidence, erosion, and increase carbon emissions from stored organic matter. The refuge's management strategy emphasizes protecting permafrost-dependent landscapes to maintain ecosystem balance and limit disturbances that could exacerbate permafrost degradation. Why is permafrost important? Permafrost is permanently frozen ground that remains at or below 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 2 consecutive years. It is found in polar regions like the Arctic and in high-altitude areas such as mountain ranges. Permafrost can consist of soil, rock, and organic material mixed with ice. The picture in the background is of permafrost in ANWR. Permafrost is a critical natural resource in the ANWR. It serves as a foundation for the region's freshwater systems by regulating water flow and nutrient cycles. As climate change causes permafrost to thaw, it can release previously trapped organic material and alter hydrology, potentially impacting water quality and aquatic ecosystems that support species like fish. Understanding these changes is crucial for conserving the refuge's freshwater habitats and the species that rely on them. Permafrost in the ANWR is an important environmental feature that sustains the landscape and local ecosystems, including plant and animal species adapted to the cold climate. The warming temperatures due to climate change have led to permafrost thawing, causing various environmental and infrastructural problems. Thawing permafrost leads to erosion along coastlines and riverbanks, which can harm wildlife habitats, affect migration patterns, and erode the land that is crucial for both wildlife and human activities. Another harmful result is as permafrost thaws, trapped greenhouse gases like methane are released into the atmosphere. The thawing permafrost can destabilize infrastructure, including roads, buildings, and oil pipelines, especially if the region is developed for resource extraction. Given the importance of permafrost in the region's ecological balance and the growing concerns surrounding climate change, addressing the issue is crucial for long-term conservation and sustainable management of the ANWR. Acts and laws regarding permafrost in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. There are a few. The Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act was created for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and mandates the protection of its ecological values. It specifically recognizes the need for conservation of the refuge's natural resources, including its permafrost, ecosystems, and wildlife. The Act allows limited resource development, but stipulates that such activities should not compromise the long-term integrity of the environment. Another important act is the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. NEPA requires federal agencies to assess the environmental impacts of major actions, such as oil and gas exploration, that might affect permafrost and the broader ecosystem in the ANWR. A full environmental impact statement may be required for any new or significant actions, such as oil drilling or construction in areas where permafrost is located. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 mandates the protection of species that are threatened or endangered. The thawing of permafrost could jeopardize the habitats of species like the polar bear, caribou, and migratory birds. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service must work to ensure that permafrost thawing does not further endanger these species' survival. The Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act are acts that regulate air and water pollution, including the release of greenhouse gases and pollutants that might result from permafrost thaw. USFWS must monitor and regulate activities in the ANWR to compete with air and water quality standards. An applicable case law for this is Alaska versus U.S. Department of the Interior in 2001. In this case, the court ruled that the Interior Department's decision-making regarding ANWR must be guided by the principles of conservation and that resource extraction cannot be allowed at the expense of critical environmental features such as permafrost. Another applicable law would be Kleppe versus New Mexico in 1976. This case affirmed the federal government's broad authority to manage public lands and natural resources, highlighting that the government can regulate activities on federal land to protect environmental resources, including permafrost. Actions the United States Fish and Wildlife Service should take: continue to monitor and access permafrost changes with comprehensive monitoring of permafrost conditions through partnerships with the U.S. Geological Survey and other research entities. This will provide necessary data for informed decision-making and adaptive management strategies. They could continue to engage with indigenous communities, environmental advocacy groups, state and local authorities, and other federal agencies to develop consensus on best practices for permafrost management. This could include creating protected zones or reducing development in permafrost-sensitive areas. USFWS could review and revise resource development plans. In line with NEPA, USFWS must ensure that any new projects within ANWR undergo thorough environmental assessments to understand their impact on permafrost and wildlife. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service should impose stringent regulations on oil and gas activities, ensuring that they do not destabilize permafrost or violate conservation requirements. If this does not work, do not sufficiently address the permafrost management issues, USFWS can work with Congress to propose new legislation aimed at preserving permafrost and mitigating climate change in the region. USFWS should integrate climate change considerations into management planning for ANWR with specific actions to protect the permafrost ecosystem. This includes implementing mitigation strategies for the release of greenhouse gases and considering new approaches to infrastructure that minimize the impact of permafrost thawing. So positions from other parties would vary. Environmental organizations would have a strong position from environmental groups advocating for the protection of ANWR from oil drilling or other resource extraction activities, emphasizing the need to preserve permafrost and mitigate climate change impacts. Many indigenous groups support protecting ANWR from oil exploration due to the threat it poses to their traditional lands, wildlife, and the integrity of permafrost-based ecosystems. The views from Congress are divided. Some lawmakers calling for the development of ANWR's oil resources, citing economic benefits, while others strongly advocate for environmental protection and the preservation of permafrost and wildlife habitats. The state government in Alaska may pressure the USFWS to allow more development in ANWR, arguing that economic benefits outweigh environmental concerns, especially in light of Alaska's reliance on oil revenues. As for the courts, they will likely continue to play a role in balancing conservation and development, ensuring that any actions taken by the USFWS comply with federal laws and court precedents regarding environmental protection. So, managing these challenges, to effectively manage the challenges posed by thawing permafrost in ANWR, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service should adopt a multifaceted approach that aligns with its conservation mandate, legal obligations, and the pressing realities of climate change. So, USFWS could collaborate with the U.S. Geological Survey, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and other scientific institutions to establish comprehensive permafrost monitoring networks. This should include both physical monitoring and environmental assessments of permafrost thaw impacts on local ecosystems. Accurate data on these conditions will allow USFWS to anticipate changes and implement adaptive management strategies. This approach will help prevent irreversible ecological damage to wildlife habitats and provide necessary information for future policy making and resource management. Working closely with local indigenous communities who have traditional knowledge of this land are directly impacted by changes in permafrost would be a good move. This can involve establishing formal consultation processes, developing co-management agreements, and supporting community-based monitoring of permafrost and its effects on the environment. Indigenous communities have long-standing relationships with the land and are often the first to observe and respond to environmental changes. Their inclusion in decision-making will not only foster trust but also improve the effectiveness of conservation efforts. The USFWS should update its environmental impact assessment procedures to incorporate the latest climate science,